Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this International Platform on Sustainable Finance event at the EU Pavilion here in Sharm-el-Sheikh at COP27. My name is Nancy Sach. I'm the European Investment Bank's Chief Climate Change Expert, and I'm delighted today that we are joined by Commissioner Mairead McGuinness, who is the European Commissioner for Financial Services, and she's going to make some welcoming and opening remarks. So over to you, Commissioner.
Well, good morning, Nancy. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. And I join in your welcoming all of our platform members, observers, and indeed all participants to this very important event this morning. And for me, it is a great honour to chair the International Platform on Sustainable Finance and to talk at this, our annual event marking our third year. I think when this platform was established in 2019, I don't think anyone expected we would achieve such a broad global reach in just 3 years. We have 18 member jurisdictions, all from all of the continents, united in this common commitment to the future of our planet. And this is a really important achievement because climate change is undoubtedly one of the greatest challenges facing the world. And this year alone, we have witnessed unprecedented droughts, heat waves, floods and wildfires. And that gives us a very bleak preview of what life could look like for future generations if we do not act now and act fast, because these events could become more common and indeed more severe. So all of this requires ambitious reductions in greenhouse gas emissions this decade and net zero emissions by 2050. And of course, we're speaking against the background of Russia's illegal and unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine, which has caused an energy crisis in Europe and indeed on energy markets globally. I would say that the measures we have taken and the solidarity and unity we've shown, this will allow us get through this very difficult crisis. But I think this horrible war has driven home even more starkly the need to accelerate the transition and to end our dependency on fossil fuels. And we will do that by ramping up investments in renewables. Sustainable finance, which is an area under my responsibility here in the Commission, it supports these goals by encouraging the financial sector to finance the transition and indeed for the finance sector itself to make the transition. What we need is good, credible and comparable information, because this can stimulate demand for sustainable financial products. And it supports the financing of the transition while addressing the risks of greenwashing. In the European Union, we have our EU taxonomy, providing a tool to guide private investment towards sustainable activities. So in the EU, we're putting great efforts into making sustainable finance, our EU sustainable finance framework, fully usable and coherent. And it is time for implementation and accountability at international level too. So we need a more robust transition, net zero standards and stronger accountability and transparency on how commitments are put into practice. And as UN Secretary General Guterres said, we cannot afford slow movers, fake movers, or any form of greenwashing. And in this context, we value the International Platform on Sustainable Finance enormously. I really appreciate the positive efforts being made by all of us, our members and observers. And together, we must take responsibility to do what is needed to deliver the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Paris Agreement. Our platform is also an opportunity to show that different sustainable finance frameworks can work together coherently. For taxonomies, that means following shared principles and identifying what different taxonomies have in common. For transition finance, it means promoting common principles that can be applied at activity, entity, or portfolio level. Promoting common principles at global level can help improve consistency across different approaches to sustainable investment. Countries and regions around the world are developing their own taxonomies, and these are being debated and discussed in different international fora. It is vital that we avoid unnecessary fragmentation and confusion in the market. The transition finance principles put forward by this platform build on science-based, ambitious targets for a strong, just and sustainable transition. And these principles do not conflict with other goals. They aim to ensure that companies provide evidence of their ability to deliver over time with good planning, governance, policy, engagement, and monitoring at the very heart of their operations. Furthermore, these principles promote transparency and comparability of all these aspects, and that will allow financial market participants to make decisions on allocation. And these principles are actionable while taking into account different circumstances and starting points. The fact that the work of this platform has fed into G20 discussions on alignment and the transition finance framework really illustrates the value of this forum. More collaboration should lead to greater capital flows towards sustainability. And the more we work together, the faster we make progress. And speed is important. Doing this will require commitment from all of us. Climate change needs to be at the very center of the agenda for every policymaker and every company. So I'm keen to see future exchanges in this platform and to see how we can keep learning from each other, because we are all in this crisis together and we can overcome it together while respecting each other's specific circumstances. And I believe that out of this crisis, together we can create opportunities, new jobs, new markets, stronger and more resilient economies, and in particular, more sustainable economies and societies. So I look forward very much to listening in to this morning's discussion, hearing your views, learning from you. So a big thank you from Brussels.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. And I'm delighted to say that we are welcome today several members of the international platform who are going to be talking about their work, their leading of the work on transition report, which is published today, and also more generally the work of the international platform and how that fits with what they're doing in their jurisdictions and how they're using it in the work that they're doing. I think I would like to highlight that the two reports published today by the international platform do make an important step forward in their contribution to the discussion, which, you know, if we're going to be honest, there is indeed a risk of a new thing, perhaps called transition wash, because so many entities around the world are now moving, if you like, from the first and very important discussion on climate finance and green finance. And of course, that's a big topic here at COP27, to the bigger discussion of how do we support the transition of the whole economy. And so while all these different discussions are going on around the world, and, you know, we have also seen the very important G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group report on transition finance, many other entities producing guidance on transition plans for companies, then the work of the international platform, which brings together all these jurisdictions and actually sort of pools the thinking on topics such as, not just as we did last year, the common ground taxonomy for climate finance, for green finance, but importantly, this new report on transition finance. And if you have not seen those reports, they are now public, and I do invite you to look at that. Before I go to the panel, I'm going to say a few things myself about this important topic, and a little bit about what multilateral development banks are doing, because although the EIB is the EU's bank, it is also currently the chair of the heads of MDBs, and MDBs are also taking a lot of action, obviously in their own sphere of work, but jointly, and in particular on the low carbon and resilient transition. So one thing I want to highlight, I think that's important, is we need to get into our mind that all finance has to be Paris aligned. That's what Article 2.1c says. And so we have to think about how can we, as public banks, as private banks, as regulators, as supervisors, how can we, in the public and private finance sphere, support that transition to get the whole of finance Paris aligned? And here I'm going to highlight that when you read the Paris Agreement and that bit about aligning the finance flows, it's clear that we're talking about the low carbon transition, but we're also talking about the resilience transition, driving a very important agenda, which is to make sure that all finance flows are climate resilient. and both of those things are important. The last thing I want to say about that is, of course, that brings in the just transition angle as well. And although that might not be part of climate finance, green finance, it's an incredibly important deliverable. And it is part of many transition plans. And I'm going to just highlight why that is. We have obviously a real need as we move all finance and activities at whatever pace their sector needs. But as the Commissioner said, we don't have much time. So it has to be urgent and ambitious transition to something that's compatible with the Paris goals. And we have activities and companies that are perhaps part of that, if you like, low carbon, green transition. And we need obviously to support as much finance as possible going to that climate finance, green finance. But we also need to really support this transition in the rest of the economy that may not perhaps be able to be green, may not be able to be low carbon right now. But that is incredibly important that it's supported in that transition. And again, you could almost say that that is just as important, because if we're doing a lot of green finance, but we're still financing a lot of things that are causing the problem when we're not actually solving the problem. So that transition of moving activities and companies to a state of Paris alignment is, I think, important. And one thing I want to highlight, we often talk about just transition as being for the activities that cannot transition. So we're looking at what happens to people employed in the thermal coal mining industry. But I want to highlight that even in an activity that can transition, let's take something like a vehicle manufacture, within that supply chain of that whole activity, there is a whole chunk of the supply chain that also cannot transition, because perhaps they supply the part of that industry that cannot go into a low carbon world. I'm thinking about things like spark plugs, for example, or petrol piping. So we really need to take a much wider look at how just transition comes into even the activities that are making this move to low carbon. As the EU bank, we are actively supporting the EU taxonomy, and we're actively supporting the International Platform on Sustainable Finance. Our president is an observer on the international platform, and we've been contributing to the Common Ground taxonomy work. And obviously this year, I've had the honor of contributing to the Transition Finance report. And in fact, we are using the EU's green taxonomy to capture our climate action and environmental sustainability. It's a bit of a mouthful, but you could think of it as green. But our decision was to keep those words because we wanted to be really clear to our shareholders and stakeholders what our target is. And that, I want to mention the environmental sustainability part. We are here at COP. We are talking about Paris alignment. We are talking about low carbon and resilient transition. But we also know that nature and biodiversity, the circular economy, the state of the oceans, and all these other environmental objectives are absolutely linked. And we are hearing here at the COP the essential nature of tackling these problems together. So indeed, although we're here talking about, if you like, a low carbon and resilient transition, I would say that at some point we have to think about, well, what is the transition to a more circular economy? What is the transition to a nature positive economy? What is the transition to, a sustainable water use economy? So we're focused on climate at the moment. I think that's a good place to start. The transition report has started there, but we have to remember that there's, if you like, a bigger transition that's needed to transform our economies. The transition report talks about activities, companies, and portfolios. And I'm just now going to mention that for the MDBs, obviously, we see all these as important. So we have activities, and when we talk about activities that we finance, we always have a client, and we see our job as MDBs to support the transition of those clients. At the end of the day, it's not the multilateral development banks that have to be Paris aligned. Our job is to help everybody that we're financing be Paris aligned. And therefore, in our Paris alignment framework, we also focus on doing more climate finance, doing more green finance, and helping all our clients and our projects move to a transition to a situation where they are compatible. So in MDB terms, you might say, not everything has to be green, but everything has to be Paris aligned. And I think there's a number of taxonomies and a number of members of the international platform are working with similar thinking. So we have, for example, the ASEAN taxonomy that has green and amber. we have the EU Sustainable Finance Strategy that talks about green and sustainable, and also talks about looking at intermediated transition. And we have the MDBs, as I said, looking at climate finance and Paris alignment. So in all of these things, transition is critical. Support for companies in their transition plans, but also support for public entities. And the MDBs, the last thing I'm going to say, are talking and have explained yesterday that they are working on supporting long-term strategies for their clients. And that ultimately is all about the transition. And with that, I'm delighted now to take us to some members of the platform themselves who can tell us much more about what's been going on in the transition report work. And I'm going to go first to, I believe, the member of the international platform for Switzerland. And I'm apologize, I have actually, I'm on my mobile phone and I cannot see the names of the speakers. So perhaps you would introduce yourself and say, you know, what your role has been and give us some insights into the work that's been done. I'm told by the Secretariat that I should go to Mr. Satoshi first. So I do apologize. I'm going to go to Mr. Satoshi Aikida, and who will give us the Japanese input and thoughts on the transition work of the platform from his role as co-chair of that work. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Well, I don't care about the order of speech, but if I need to go first, I'm happy to do that. Well, thank you for that introduction. I'm from Japan Financial Services Agency, and I had the privilege of co-chairing the transition finance working group together with Christoph from the Switzerland and also Lucia from European Commission. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the co-chairs and also the members and observers of this working group for producing this wonderful report, I would say. Well, as Nancy already outlined, that the report put forward a certain principles for the transition finance and also propose a certain categorization of the transition finance based upon certain activity-based ones and also entity-based ones and portfolio-based ones. Well, because there are so many initiatives related with transition finance, and well, name a few, G20, OECD, and the G-Funds activities also can be considered as a transition finance-related activities. So there are many others. So, well, what this report attempted is to, well, set out a certain overarching framework to understand what's going on under the label of transition finance. And in that attempt, I believe that certain categorization based upon activities, entities, and portfolios has a tremendous value in understanding what's going on. And also, the report attempted to answer that how taxonomies work for transition finance, and at the same time also try to answer that how transition finance would work without taxonomies. And the latter thing it could be important because, well, not all jurisdictions have adopted the taxonomy-based sustainable finance framework. And as the ISSB will put forward the IFRS sustainability reporting standards on climate issues, and I understand that they do not necessarily include the taxonomy-based metrics in their requirements. So maybe in certain jurisdictions, they need to go forward for the transition finance without taxonomies. So, well, what will be the use of taxonomies in the context of transition finance, but how we can go forward with transition finance without taxonomies is also a very important question to answer. And well, I'm proud to say that this report made a certain success in proposing a certain framework for transition finance with and without taxonomies together. Well, in Japan's case, we pretty much focused on entity-based and I would say without taxonomy type transition finance. But in order to prevent certain transition washing, we certainly have created a certain roadmaps for certain hard-to-abate sectors and also for certain guidance on using such roadmaps and assessing the entities' activities based upon certain science-based, robust target setting and also delivery of such targets. And so I'm very happy that because this tax transition finance report covers a very breadth of the possibilities of exploring transition finance opportunities. And Japan's approach is one of them. But I think, transition finance initiatives put forward by G20 and OECD and G-Fund and many others will, I think, converge into a certain form put forward by this report in the end. Also, as Nancy mentioned, we basically talked about transition finance for climate, but I think as Nancy said, that the resilience transition and transition for other sustainability challenges is also important. And I believe that this framework can be replicated for those other challenges than climate. Because if we can set out a certain goal like Paris climate goals and breaking down the certain targets for achieving such goals, then we can certainly frame the transition finance for activities or entities or portfolios who strive to achieve that goal through pursuing a certain set of targets in line with that goal. And this transition finance framework, although it is discussed in the context of climate change, I firmly believe that it can be replicated for other environmental and societal goals. So I'm very proud to say that our transition finance is not limited to the climate, and we need to further broaden the concept of transition finance and the activities related to transition finance so that we can move forward for achieving a more sustainable economy and society for the future. And with that, I would like to pause here and then hand over to Christoph. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Satoshi, and I welcome you all from the wonderful EU Pavilion here at COP27. First of all, let me thank my co-chairs from the European Commission and Japan, as well as the entire working group for the tremendous effort that went into this year's work on transition finance. Let me also subscribe to the Commissioner's introductory remarks on us now entering the age of accountability when it comes to implementing science-based transition plans at the private sector. Thanks to the products of this working group, the IPSF has once again been a major knowledge partner in the G20 work on sustainable finance. It helped the G20 develop its high-level principles for transition plans. The working group was mandated this year to do a stocktake of various approaches used in transition finance. It identified 3 different levels, as already mentioned earlier by Satoshi, on activity level, the institutional level, and the portfolio level, and distilled a set of transition principles, both with respect to target setting and implementation considerations. Several of the principles developed by the IPSF are also central to G-Fund's guidance on net zero transition plans and its guidance on measuring portfolio alignment that were both issued last week. This shows how the work carried out here has hopefully sown seeds and cross-fertilized other work streams in a useful way. I'm also happy to announce that both the institutional level and portfolio level metrics described in the IPSF report are an integral part of the recently launched Swiss climate scores, a set of indicators that help investors assess the Paris alignment of financial products and portfolios. The scores include current state indicators such as carbon footprint and intensity and the exposure to coal, oil, and gas, as well as forward-looking metrics such as global warming indicators, the share of portfolio companies with science-based net zero targets, and the asset manager's engagement strategy on these portfolio companies. Swiss climate scores are a key measure to the Swiss Federal Council to establish transparency on climate alignment on all financial products and investments. On an institute level, we're this year planning to make TCFD mandatory across the entire economy for larger companies with a double materiality approach. And we focus very much on transition plans, science-based transition plans, including scope 3. It's key to us. Now, let me make a look ahead at 2023. Now that more and more financial institutions are formulating net zero targets and developing transition plans to implement the commitments in practice, I see a need to make sure that the information, including the progress made, is comparable, consistent, and science-based. This is why Switzerland very much supports the creation of the Net Zero Data Public Utility by the Climate Data Steering Committee. Based on such and other data sources, the OECD has developed the first concept note of tracking private sector commitments at the aggregate level, and I believe the OECD work will be instrumental in this area. I could see now also that next year's Transition Finance Working Group to shed further light on how to increase credibility of the private sector transition commitments and progression. It could have an increased focus on data and the technology needs behind that. Like this, the IPSF could continue to position itself at the heart of multilateral developments in the area of transition finance. I look very much forward to discuss with my fellow IPSF members the working group's agenda over the coming months. Let me stop here and thank you.
Thank you very much, Christoph. Just checking that as I've managed to transfer to my laptop, you can hear me well. Okay, that's great. In that case, thank you to both of the co-chairs of the work on the transition report. As I mentioned, published today. So if you haven't seen it, please do go and have a look. And now we're going to come to two countries that are going to give some insights from, two other members and observers of the international platform, going to give some insights from their side, how they see this work. So first, I'm going to turn to Gitu Joshi, who's advisor of the Ministry of Finance from the Government of India. And I'd like to ask, what is India's perspective on this work that's been undertaken on transition finance by the international platform? How do you think that this can be taken forward by different jurisdictions which have different priorities perhaps and different regional and national priorities? And how does India plan to take forward the agenda of transition finance? Because of course you are the upcoming G20 presidency for next year. So thank you, Gitu Joshi, if you would like to take the floor.
Thank you, Ms. Nancy. Thank you so much for the brief introduction. I'm advisor in the Ministry of Finance in India, and I handle work related to Sustainable Finance Working Group in the G20. A very good morning to everyone, and let me begin by extending my warm wishes to all the distinguished colleagues from IPSF member countries, observers, and other esteemed colleagues who have joined for today's event. I would like to extend my special thanks to the IPSF Secretariat for organizing this event, which will surely bring about enriching deliberations in this panel discussion. And yes, before I give my comments, I would definitely like to congratulate IPSF Secretariat for successfully coming out with the IPSF Annual Report 2022 and the IPSF Transition Finance Report. As we are all aware, transition to low carbon pathways will mean a fundamental shift in operations of various entities that will require significant amount of financing to achieve net zero goals. An effective transition finance framework can support an economy-wide transition to net zero emissions. Work undertaken by SFWG and IPSF on transition finance frameworks has laid a strong foundation to enhance the flow of funds towards transition activities. The IPSF Transition Finance Report has mainly focused on climate mitigation transition to achieve sustainable and equitable economy. The report rightly emphasizes that in order for transition to be effective and finance to be appropriately directed, any transition framework or tool needs to ensure that transition is robust and credible. India acknowledges the excellent work done by IPSF on transition finance and is of the view that transition principles should be voluntary in nature and not be prescriptive of pathways of transition. The transition pathways should be based on domestic circumstances and national priorities to ensure just, affordable, and orderly transition. This will provide countries with the flexibility in the choice of options for transition. We are supportive of the flexible and dynamic nature of these principles based on evolving market, technological developments, policy environment, and abatement cost curves. However, it is crucial that the transition must be aligned with the common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, which is also the core principle of Paris Agreement, and that transition should happen in a phased manner. Further, while implementing these transition principles, we should take into account the concerns regarding the commercial feasibility and cost of adoption of new technology and net zero pathways, particularly for the small and medium enterprises. Deployment of digital technology is thus critical for reducing the cost of transition finance for the small and medium enterprises. The report does recommend that disclosure of material scope 3 emissions data could follow a gradual approach as it becomes possible, reflecting progress on data availability. In this regard, I would like to focus to underscore that there are significant data gaps and lack of sufficient technical expertise in identification and reporting of relevant information. So yes, maturing on this aspect in a phased manner is critical for developing and emerging economies. While we welcome the work done by IPSF, however, more deliberations might be required for reducing the cost and transition washing risk of financial institutions, which will be needed especially in the developing countries which deal with capacity building constraints. I would also, in this background, like to highlight India's perspective on transition finance and the work which has been done in India, so that we can learn from each other's experience. Some of us would know that India has recently updated its NDCs in August 2022, and the updated NDCs seek to enhance India's contributions towards achievement of strengthening of global response to climate change as agreed under the Paris Agreement. Such actions will also help India usher in low emissions growth pathways. As per updated NDCs, India now stands committed to reduce emission intensity of its GDP by 45% by 2030 from the 2005 level and achieve about 50% cumulative electric power installed capacity from non-fossil fuel-based energy resources by 2030. India is progressively taking steps for ensuring that economic growth goes hand in hand with climate goals, focusing on reduction in the greenhouse gas emissions. Large Indian companies and public sector undertakings are also looking to reduce their carbon footprint, which will increase the demand for renewable power. The Indian Railways, which operates one of the largest rail networks in the world, also has a major role in contributing towards India's NDCs. it has set a target of becoming a net zero entity by 2030 by completing all electrification of all the railway tracks. Financing will, however, be a key challenge for achieving these targets. In view of this, in the recent years, sustainable debt, which refers to raising of resources through issuance of green bonds, sustainable bonds, sustainability-linked bonds, etc., has emerged as means to access a larger pool of capital globally. In this context, India has come out with liberalized external commercial borrowing norms that have enabled Indian renewable energy companies and other firms to tap the ECB route for raising finance through issuance of sustainable debt, reflecting the growing attractiveness of this route for raising finance. Learning from India's experience, I would like to reiterate that at this juncture, efforts must be guided for jurisdictions to coordinate and learn from one another to adopt best practices. I hope India's experience will be valuable to other developing nations as they translate their climate pledges into actions and undertake energy transitions towards a more sustainable energy future. Going forward to your specific issue regarding India assuming the G20 presidency this year, yes, our vision is to seek just and equitable growth for all as we navigate through these turbulent times in a more sustainable, holistic, responsible, and inclusive manner. The theme for our presidency, launched just yesterday by our Honorable Prime Minister, is One Earth, One Family, One Future. Developing on the work done by IPSF and SFWG, the Sustainable Finance Working Group under the Indonesian presidency, during India's G20 presidency, we are yet to finalize the areas or priority areas which we will take up. We are in consultation with the co-chairs, and we will be firming up these hopefully by end of this month, and will be sharing the same with all the G20 countries as well as other members here. While we are doing that, we do have some preliminary thoughts of works which we will take forward during our presidency, and continuing from what the work which has been done by the Indonesian presidency. Keeping in mind that transition towards greener economy is the key to achieving our Paris Agreement goals, we would like to focus on raising adequate finance for climate action. As we all know that most significant economies have set up high and ambitious net zero targets, and therefore the climate action requires substantial enhancement in financial flows, especially in developing economies. The transition towards a low carbon economy also poses additional risks of losing competitiveness, sluggish growth, and development losses. Finance will be vital to address these issues to enable the transition to sustainability. Thus, criticality of finance as grants or at concessional terms or from multiple sources, it cannot be overemphasized in the context of developing and low-income economies. The mobilization of financial resources for climate action towards transiting towards a greener economy is proposed to be an important theme that would drive the discussion on the instruments through which the mobilization could be achieved. In addition, of course, there is a significant interaction of finance with technology. And so while we are transiting towards greener and cleaner economies, it would be important to have discussions on deployment of early stage climate technologies and finding financial solutions to improve access to technology. Going further, in order to incentivize economic activities to achieve transition, we would like to deliberate on the role of public policy levers. As we all know, public policy levers and regulatory policies can play a critical role in nudging production and consumption behavior to be more sustainable, thereby enabling countries to pursue the low carbon development pathway. Public policy lever options would also be unique to each country, involving issues of prioritization, development, revenues, and other consideration. So a discussion around the kind of policies in place in different countries would be a good learning for all the countries to jointly come up with, some kind of perhaps a compendium or something which will help all the countries to move towards transition. Another area which we would like to deliberate upon.
Me too. I'm sorry. Could I ask you to start to wrap up, because we have two more speakers, okay. And I'm really sorry. What you're saying is very interesting. You could. Thank you.
No. Yeah. So just briefly touch upon the other two aspects is that sustainable development goals is also something which we will want to focus along, because social sectors are equally important, and the point that there has to be just and equitable transition. We need to focus on financing of all sustainable development goals. And lastly, capacity building will take us forward, towards having a sustainable system where financing is available to all. I'd like to thank all of you, and I'd like to thank IPSF Secretariat for giving us an opportunity to present India's views and keeping up with the spirit of the international economic cooperation. We are hopeful that together with all the countries, we are able to move and promote transition towards greener, more resilient and inclusive societies and economies. Thank you so much. Sorry for taking a little more time.
No, that's okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. And probably we could have spent more time, but I would like to pass on now to Daryl Ho. Mr. Ho is the Executive Director for the Banking Policy, Hong Kong Monetary Authority. And I'd like to ask you, as a banking supervisor, what do you see as the implication of climate change for banks? And in what way could a banking supervisor encourage the bank's support for transition finance? So over to you, Mr. Ho, thank you. And if you could try and keep to the time, that would be
excellent. Thank you so much for the questions, Nancy. And I think many speakers have already pointed out that the financial sector plays a very important role in driving the delivery of the goal under the Paris Agreement. And equally, climate change would mean one of the key risks faced by the banking sector. I think many of you are quite familiar with how climate change can transmit to the risks of the banks and the financial institutions, mainly in the form of physical risk and transition risk, and therefore transmitting to the traditional risk types faced by banks. One stress test exercise that we did last year is just to try to look into how this orderly transition scenario can impact on the capital adequacy of banks. And in our stress test, our domestically systemically important banks would possibly face a 3 percentage points drop in the capital adequacy ratio over a 5-year time horizon. So that is an example to illustrate that climate change can have a profound impact on the financial health of banks. And therefore, it is important that banks have to put in place measures to enhance the resilience to climate risk and properly price and manage those risks. Now, the challenge facing banks and the regulators is that we are lacking an international standard like the Basel standard in guiding the management of climate risk. And in this regard, it is encouraging to see that in June this year, the Basel Committee has issued the principles for the effective management and supervision of climate-related financial risk. That actually will provide, a very important step to improve practices in corporate governance, internal control, risk assessment, management, and reporting related to climate risk. And we would have a better convergence in these practices. Now, addressing climate issue is not just about risk management. Banks also have a role to play in supporting the transition, including the provision of transition finance. And I guess this is one of the key topics of this year. And the core function, as many has pointed out, that of the financial sector is to allocate capital. So to channel more capital resources to support the transition could help achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, and the financial sector, of course, is an integral part of that process. And equally important, there is a huge funding gap with business opportunity. Now, let me take China as an example. According to an estimate by the central bank, there will be a need to invest about 2.2 trillion RMB per year to reduce carbon emissions at this juncture. And this number will further grow to 3.9 trillion per year between 2030 and 2060. So there is a huge funding gap that needs to be filled by the banks as well as the rest of the financial community. And therefore, in view of the importance of the climate change mitigation, there were a number of frameworks and tools available or being developed with a view of supporting transition. One example, apart from the taxonomies that has been built by individual jurisdictions and also the work done by the IPSF on common ground taxonomy, we have also seen industry alliances like the GFANS has been working to provide recommendation on developing net zero transition plans, and the TCFD also, on the guidance surrounding the disclosure of the transition plan. And in this regard, I would want to welcome the publication of the IPSF's Transition Finance Report. I think the report has provided an extremely useful landscape analysis and highlighted in the report some of the key features of the various frameworks and tools on transitions. So I think that would be a very useful resources for banks committing to support the transition. Now, Nancy, you asked about what is the role of the banking supervisors in encouraging banks' support for transition finance. Of course, from a supervisor's perspective, our key objective is to promote financial and banking stability. But banks, whether it would support transition is also a very important subject to tackle, because climate change has already become high on the global agenda, and it also draws so much attention from the investment community and the public. So when the banking sector facing its stakeholders, if they are taking no action or really slow in taking action, that could arouse concern about the misalignment with the economy-wide or the internationally agreed climate goals. So banks would, their inaction, would face competition, reputation, and long-term resilience consequences. So they need to actually take action. And this is actually dear to the heart of the supervisor as well. And second point is that an orderly transitions would help mitigate not only the effects of climate change, but also the potential adverse impacts to the financial system. Now, if you think about a scenario under which that banks would just simply cut off all the financing for the brown industry or not so green industry, that would create an economic impact as well as a potential impact on the financial system, as well. So it is important that the banks would need to engage the borrowers in assist them, in doing the transition, and the finance should actually be provided to the borrowers, in the understanding that the borrowers are actually moving towards a path that is consistent with the net zero goal by the middle of the century. So otherwise, the lack of a orderly transition would result in a disruptive financial exclusion scenario that will have an impact on the financial stability. So that is also, why, transition is important to us as the banking supervisor. Now, regarding this, a number of tools have the potential to be used by the supervisors to drive actions to support transition. For instance, we have issued supervisory guidance that would alert banks of the potential adverse impacts arising from inaction and misalignment with climate goals, and also sharing the range of good practices among banks that can be shared across, different members of the industry. We have also been working on promoting disclosures that would enhance transparency and therefore creating an environment for further actions, by the banks. Now, last but not least, another piece of tool that we are actually looking into is the use of the Pillar 2 framework. And obviously, given the nature of climate risk and also transition finance, it would not be straightforward, if we want to make use of a Pillar 1 capital framework to create the incentives for banks to take into account these factors in the risk management and the running of the business. And due to the reason that climate risk is forward-looking, and likewise the impact of transition finance and potential impact on the financial stability is also a forward-looking issue. And therefore, we consider that, the supervisory review process and also the design of the Pillar 2 capital requirement imposed on individual bank would be an area that we can look at. So currently, the HKMA is actually studying, how the Pillar 2 framework can be modified and adjusted in order to provide stronger incentives for the banks to speed up their work on climate risk management, as well as supporting transition finance. And with that, I stop here, Nancy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I've just had a problem with the microphone. Just checking. Can you hear me well again?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. So now, after that very interesting input from a banking supervisor, we're going to turn to a bank. And I'm delighted that we have Mr. Harry Boyd Carpenter, Director for Climate at EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And Harry, I would be delighted to give the floor to you to give the perspective from EBRD's point of view in terms of your important role as a regional MDB on the work of the international platform, and particularly the transition finance report, and how is EBRD perhaps taking forward some of these recommendations, and how will it be used in your work? Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Nancy. And I want to start by very much welcoming, on behalf of EBRD, the IPSF report and congratulate the teams involved on the work involved. It's an extremely important report, an extremely influential one, and it's a very powerful foundation for the work we're all trying to do. We particularly welcome the emphasis on the 1.5 degrees, and we particularly welcome the emphasis on the need for urgent action, because urgent action is at the heart of transition finance. And we know that transition finance is a critical area. It's the hard bit. It's the bit between the things we know but should not be financed and the things that are easy to finance and that clearly should be. But there's a very large middle ground where we know that there's a difficult, heavy emitting sectors, industries and economies and economic activities that have to find a route through to a clear end goal, but a very difficult, unclear route to it. So that's why this report is so valuable. That's why this area is so important. Because if we abandon it, if we don't do the difficult work, we know we won't achieve either the final end goal or the very important rapid peaking and rapid reductions that we need. And if I turn to the influence and the role of EBRD and how this ties into our work, I think it's critical to recall for us that EBRD is a transition bank. Our Article 1 of our establishing agreement, which sets out our mandate and our purpose, defines our role as fostering a transition. So we've always been involved in transition. We've just increasingly reinterpreted and redefined and re-understood what that transition means. And it's clear to us now that a well-functioning market economy, the goal that we are meant to be transitioning our countries of operation towards, is necessarily a sustainable, green, low carbon and resilient economy. So transition is at the heart of our mandate. And we achieve that transition through 3 channels. One is we have goals for our green finance that actively accelerates that transition, that actively moves us towards it. We have a goal that by 2025, at least half our business should be green. We achieved that goal last year. And so we continue to stretch ourselves. But that's one way we do this. We push ourselves to finance more and more of the type of investments that accelerate that transition and move it forward. A second channel for delivery for us is policy dialogue and reform activity. And we believe that this is fundamental, and we believe that it's very closely linked to the financial activity. So we work at every level. We work with countries, we work with cities, we work with regions, we work with corporates, and we work to help them design their way through this very difficult transition. We sit with clients and we sit with countries and cities and companies. And when they say to us, look, we want to get to a net zero goal, we want to reduce our emissions, we want to find our way, our job is to help them write a map for that, to help them give them a plan. So that is the fundamental systemic reform work we do, which both creates the environment in which we can then invest, but also sets out what a transition looks like and helps those companies reform their operations and their activities far beyond the investments that we are supporting. That's the second channel, the policy dialogue and the systemic reform. And then the third channel is that EBRD, like all other development banks, has a commitment that all of our activities should be Paris aligned. For us, the deadline we've set for ourselves is from the 1st of January 2023. We believe we're on track for that. It's an extremely intensive work, as Nancy, you know very well, better than anyone, in fact. But it will, we believe, fundamentally reshape the way we operate, and we see that happening now. And I think it's very important that we see the Paris alignment commitment and the transition principles as very closely aligned. And in particular, what's important to us is that they are seen not just as a compliance check, it's not just as something you have to get through, you have to prove, but also as a framework for shaping and increasing our ambition. We take this commitment to Paris aligned, and it makes us, and it makes our counterparts think about what does a company or a city or a country in transition do? What is the way in which you can continue to invest in a heavy emitting sector while still believing that you're Paris aligned? So we don't want to see it as a constraint, and we don't want to see it as as something that we just run through a checklist and it's either yes or it's no. Rather, we use this Paris alignment commitment as a way of reshaping our ambition and resetting our ambition, a way of saying to ourselves, yes, this company can continue to operate, and yes, we can continue to finance it, but only under these conditions, only when these commitments are made, this reform pathway is set. And I think that is really where the transition finance principles are so helpful for us and important for us, because they really give us the guardrails, they give us a framework that allow us to say, what does a transition look like? And when we have those frameworks, and we have those guardrails, it's enabling. It's enabling for investment, and it's enabling for new ways of operation. So to conclude, we as a bank are hugely committed to transition. It's in our mandate, it's our founding purpose. We have a series of channels to work in, and for all of them, and most especially for our Paris alignment commitment, the transition finance principles and the valuable work in this report are absolutely fundamental. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harry, with the EBRD perspective. We've overrun a little bit, and I couldn't possibly sum up all the very interesting inputs you've given. I heard a lot of support for the work of the international platform. I heard about the importance of remembering SMEs, the social aspects. I heard about the importance of the role of regulators and supervisors in encouraging this kind of transition within the financial system. I heard several of you highlight the need for us to be really clear that net zero is not a sort of standalone goal. It's a temperature goal that's the goal. Net zero is the end position we need to get to. And to do that, the transition has to be urgent and it has to be ambitious. Otherwise, unfortunately, by the time we get to net zero, we will have, as the UN Secretary General said, gone over the edge of the cliff. So thank you all for joining us today. I believe that this transition report is going to help a lot of us as we go forward, looking at the low carbon transition, the resilience transition, the wider environmental transition, and importantly, a just and equitable transition. And I look forward to the work of the international platform next year, and to working with all of you and the other members and observers on the next important topics for the platform. Thank you very much, and have a good day. Thank you.